Welcome to session 33 of our class on the Conquest. We're in 2 Kings chapter 8. And to introduce chapter 8, verse 1 through chapter 9 and verse 37, we look back for a moment at Job. And Eliphaz, one of Job's friends, said some foolish things to Job. But he also stated some eternal principles. One of them being in Job 4 and verse 8, where he said, "Even as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." Solomon repeated this truth in Proverbs 22:8. "He who sows iniquity will reap sorrow." And the prophet Hosea put it graphically when he said in Hosea 8 and verse 7, they sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. Well, Jeroboam, Omri, and Ahab had led the northern kingdom of Israel into idolatry. And Jehoram, who married a daughter of Ahab, had introduced Baal worship into the kingdom of Judah. Both kingdoms were rebellious against the Lord and polluted by idolatry. But now the day of judgment had arrived for Ahab's dynasty, the day that the prophet Elijah had predicted in 1 Kings chapter 21. In verses 1 through 6 of 2 Kings 8, obviously this event had to take place before the healing of Naaman in 2 Kings 5, since the king wasn't likely to welcome a leper into the palace, and Gehazi was a leper. The author of 2 Kings doesn't claim to follow a strict chronology, and we're not even sure which king Gehazi was entertaining with stories about his master. Perhaps this event occurred early in the reign of King Joram. This account reminds us of the greatness of the Lord. The events that follow reveal the sinfulness of people. But this section gives us a reminder that God is great and will accomplish His purposes in spite of the sinfulness of people, great and small. We were introduced to the wealthy Shunammite woman and her family back in chapter 4. God often used famines to chasten His people when they were disobedient and needed to be reminded of their covenant obligations. This famine may have been the one mentioned in chapter 4 and verse 38. The prophet warned the woman to escape the famine by going to the land of the Philistines. Knowing in advance that the famine was coming, she was able to secure a temporary home in Philistia ahead of the others who would flee Israel. Note that her husband is not mentioned. Since he was older than she, it may be that he was dead. This famine came because the Lord called for it, and He could command it because He is Lord of all. Psalm 105 and verse 16 says, "Moreover, He called for a famine in the land. He destroyed all the provision of bread." In the beginning, God spoke, and creation came into being. In these times of discipline and distress, if God's people would pray and confess their sins, God would have delivered them. When people ignore God's word, the Lord may work through His creation and remind them who is in charge. The account of the miracles in the life of the Shunammite woman reveals the awesome power of God. We remember that she had no children and her husband was old. But as with Abraham and Sarah, the Lord gave them both new life, and the woman conceived a son. But as we have seen, the son was struck with an illness and died, yet the Lord raised him from the dead. God keeps us among the living, and in His hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind. Job 12 and verse 10. For in Him we live and move and have our being. Acts 17 and verse 28. The famines remind us that God alone can make nature fruitful, and death reminds us that God alone gives life and has the power and authority to take it away. Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 8 says, "No one has power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit, and no one has power in the day of death." At the very moment Gehazi was describing this wonderful resurrection miracle to the king, the mother of the child walked into the throne room. She had returned home only to discover that strangers had taken over her estate and robbed her of 7 years of produce. In those days, it was common for people to bring such problems directly to the king, and he would decide how property should be divided. The fact that Gehazi stood there as witness to her ownership of the land made it easy for the king to pass judgment. Years before, when her husband or when her son had died, little did the mother realize that one day that bitter experience would play an important part in the preservation of her property by the providence of God. Well, this happy episode in the king's palace reveals to us the character of God and prepares us for the tumultuous events that follow. Hazael will murder Ben-Hadad and become king of Syria. Jehu will sweep through the land and kill kings, princes, and pagan priests as he wipes out the house of Ahab and the worship of Baal. Evil Queen Jezebel and Queen Mother Athaliah will both meet their death and pay for their wicked deeds. The Lord was on his throne, judging sin and fulfilling his word. No matter what occurs in history, God is in control. He knows all things and can do all things. He is present everywhere, working out his will. He is a holy God who is long-suffering with sinners, but eventually judges those who disobey him. Our world may be shaking, but our God can be trusted to do what is right. When the Lord met with the prophet Elijah on Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai, in 1 Kings 19, he gave him a threefold commission: to anoint Hazael king of Syria, to anoint Jehu king of Israel, and to anoint Elisha to minister as his successor. Well, Jehu would become God's appointed scourge to rid the land of Ahab's evil descendants, as well as Ahab's false religion. It took faith and courage for Elisha to travel to Damascus. After all, he had often thwarted the plans of Syria for raiding Israel's border towns, and he had humiliated the Syrian army by leading them into Samaria and sending them home with full stomachs but empty hands, as we saw back in chapter 6. Because of Elisha, the Syrian army fled from Samaria, and the Jewish people were able to loot their camp. But Elisha had also healed Naaman the Syrian of his leprosy. And when Elisha brought the Syrian raiding party to Samaria, he showed them mercy and saved their lives. The fact that Ben-Hadad, the Syrian king, was very ill and wanted help from the Lord made Elisha's arrival more significant. This was a pagan Gentile king seeking the help of a prophet of Jehovah, but perhaps the conversion of Naaman had something to do with it. Even more, Ben-Hadad sent Hazael, one of his high officials, to meet Elisha and give him expensive gifts. The gifts were probably more like bribes, and the king was hoping that his generosity would cause Elisha to give him a good answer. But like his master, Elisha undoubtedly refused to accept the gifts. By calling the king of Syria your son, Hazael was seeking to add more honor to Elisha. Then he asked the key question: would the king of Syria recover from his sickness? Elisha's reply appears to be deliberately ambiguous, for the Hebrew text can be read, "You will certainly recover," or "You will certainly not recover." The prophet seems to be saying the sickness will not take his life, but he will die by another means. In other words, the sickness was not terminal, but the king's life was about to be terminated. As a high officer of the king, Hazael wanted to give the king good news, so he didn't convey to him the second part of the message. Elisha was not lying to Hazael. Hazael's question, will the king recover from his sickness, was answered yes and no. No, the sickness would not kill the king, but yes, something else will kill him. However, Elisha didn't reveal what that something else was or when it would happen. Elisha stared at Hazael as though reading his mind and heart, and then the prophet broke into weeping. The Lord had shown him some of the violence and bloodshed that Hazael would perpetrate, brutal acts that were normal practices in ancient warfare. Hazael's reply indicated that he recognized his subordinate status in the government and wondered where he would get the authority to do those things. In calling himself a dog, he wasn't referring to a vicious nature. Am I some kind of dog that I would do these things? But rather, he was acknowledging that he was a nobody, an humble servant of the king, a man without such great authority. Well, Elisha's reply stunned him. Hazael would have all the authority he needed because he would become king of Syria. Well, even before Elisha announced Hazael's great promotion, the prophet may have seen in Hazael's heart his plan to murder the king. Or did the prophet's words stir up the desire in Hazael's heart? Either way, Elisha was not to blame for what Hazael decided to do. Hazael accepted the fact that he would be the next king, but he did not ask how this would come about. Elisha made it clear that the king would die, but not because of his illness. Hazael might reason this way. Well, if the king is going to die anyway, then why wait? Why not take his life now and become king much sooner? Well, when the human heart is bent on evil, it can invent all kinds of excuses. Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is more deceitful than all else, and is desperately sick. Who can understand it?" Well, when the king asked for Elisha's message, Hazael gave him the first half and said, "You will surely recover." In this he told the truth, for the king would not die from his illness. But to make sure that the second half of the message was fulfilled, Hazael smothered him with a heavy wet cloth and seized the throne for himself. He ruled Syria for 41 years. Well, in 2 Kings 8:16 and following, the writer now shifts to the southern kingdom of Judah and tells us how King Jehoram brought apostasy and judgment to the land. For 5 years, Jehoram served as co-regent with his father Jehoshaphat, and when Jehoshaphat died, he took the throne. Jehoram was married to Athaliah, a daughter of Ahab, and Jehoshaphat had joined Ahab in fighting against the Syrians at Ramoth Gilead. In other words, the wall of separation was gradually crumbling because between David's dynasty in Judah and the descendants of Ahab in Israel. The future of God's great plan of salvation depended on the continuation of the Davidic dynasty, so Jehoram was playing right into the enemy's hands. By compromising with the evil rulers of Israel, Jehoram displeased the Lord and weakened the nation. When he became king, Jehoram followed the example of Jezebel and murdered all his brothers and anybody who might threaten his authority. His father had given each of the sons a fortified city to rule, and Jehoram didn't want them to unite against him. Instead of calling them together to pray and worship God at the temple and to seek his blessing, he followed the ways of Ahab and Jezebel and ruled by the sword. Jehoram wanted his brothers out of the way so they couldn't oppose his policy of promoting the worship of Baal. Jezebel had won again. God could have destroyed the king and his kingdom, but for David's sake he kept the dynasty alive. But the Lord brought several defeats to Judah, including the revolts of Edom and Libnah. David had defeated and subdued Edom, but now they were free from Judah and put their own king on the throne. Jehoram's troops had invaded Edom, but they were surrounded by the army of Edom and barely broke through their lines to escape. We have noted before that the writer of 2 Kings didn't follow a strict chronology. In verses 2 Chronicles 21, 12 through 15 is another instance of this. That is, the translation of the prophet Elijah to heaven is recorded in 2 Kings 2:11. But Jehoram of Judah, son of Jehoshaphat, is mentioned in chapter 1 and verse 17. This means that Elijah was alive and ministering during the early part of Jehoram's reign. We don't know how much time elapsed between the accession of Joram, king of Israel, and the events recorded in 2 Kings chapter 2 that led up to the translation of Elijah. Writing this letter to the king of Judah may have been one of Elijah's last actions. Well, the prophet reminded Jehoram of three great kings of Judah: David, who founded the royal dynasty; Asa, a godly king who purged the land of evil; and Jehoram's father, Jehoshaphat. Instead of following in the ways of these kings, Jehoram patterned himself after Ahab. As a consequence, the people followed his bad example, and it wasn't difficult for him to make Baal worship popular in Judah, the one place where Jehovah should have been worshipped without compromise. Not only was Jehoram an idolater, but he was also a murderer and killed his own brothers. So the Lord would now cause him to reap what he had sown. The enemy would invade and loot the kingdom of Judah and take Jehoram's treasures as well as his wives and sons. Then the king would be afflicted with an incurable bowel disease that would give him great pain and ultimately take his life. Both of these things came true. The Philistines and the Arabs invaded Judah, robbed the palace of its treasures, and took Jehoram's wives and sons, except for young Ahaziah, also known as Jehoahaz. The king contracted a painful, lingering bowel disease and died after 2 years. But the people didn't mourn his death, nor did they stage the traditional royal bonfire in his honor. But perhaps the most humiliating thing was that his body was not placed in a royal tomb, although he was buried in the city of David. Was Jehoram's compromise worth it? Of course not. Proverbs 16:25 says, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." Unfortunately, he was followed by his son Ahaziah, who was also a follower of the Ahab clan, for his mother Athaliah was a daughter of Ahab. Ahaziah joined with his uncle King Joram to take Ramoth-Gilead from Hazael, king of Syria, and there Joram was wounded. He went to his palace at Jezreel to recover, and King Ahaziah went down to visit and encourage his uncle. Why does the writer give us these seemingly trivial details? Well, it is to let us know that the Lord was putting together the people who would be slain because of their sins. In 2 Chronicles 22:7, it says, "His going to Joram was God's occasion for Ahaziah's downfall." To have the king of Judah and the king of Israel together in one place would make it easy for Jehu to obey the commandment of the Lord. This brings us to 2 Kings chapter 9. The scene now shifts to Ramoth-Gilead, where Israel and Judah had combined their forces to recover the city from the Syrians. One of the key commanders of the Israeli army was Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, but not the Jehoshaphat who was king of Judah and the father of Jehoram. Unknown to Jehu, the prophet Elisha had dispatched one of the young sons of the prophets to anoint him king of Israel. Instead of going to the battlefield himself, Elisha wisely gave the young man the authority to anoint Jehu privately. Elisha advised the student to flee the scene as fast as he could, for obviously there was going to be a serious conflict. Jehu was having a staff meeting in the courtyard when the young man approached and asked for a private audience with the commander. They went into a private room in the house, and there the young man anointed Jehu to be the new king of Israel. It's interesting that the young prophet called the people of Israel the people of the Lord. As we've said before, even though Israel and Judah were separate kingdoms and not obedient to the covenant, the people were still the chosen ones of the Lord and Abraham's descendants. God's covenant with Abraham and with David would still stand. The people had turned away from the Lord, but he had not forsaken them. And what we need to understand here when we say these things is that God had a covenant with the group. Each individual, including the kings, was responsible for making sure that he or she was a faithful part of the group. Each individual rises or falls on their own actions and attitudes. And it is the same today. Getting back to the text, the young man didn't end his work with the anointing, but went on to explain to Jehu the work God wanted him to do. His main task was to wipe out the family of Ahab in Israel and execute God's judgment upon them because of the innocent people that they had killed. He specifically mentioned Jezebel's crimes and her judgment, referring to the words Elijah spoke when he confronted Ahab in 1 Kings chapter 21. That prophecy may have been forgotten by Ahab's descendants, but God remembered it, and the time had come to fulfill it. Just as God had wiped out the descendants of Jeroboam and Baasha, he would use Jehu to destroy the house of Ahab. The officers in the courtyard must have wondered who the young man was and why his message to Jehu was so confidential. Did he come from the front lines? Would there be a change in the battle plan? When the young man ran out of the house and fled, the officers were sure he was out of his mind. More than one servant of God had been accused of madness, including Paul and Jesus. Actually, it's the lost world that is mad, and God's people are the ones who are sane. Was it a mark of humility in Jehu that he didn't immediately announce that he was king? The officers had to pull the truth out of him, but once they knew, they accepted their commander's promotion and openly acknowledged it. As far as the biblical record is concerned, Jehu is the only king of Israel, the northern kingdom, who was anointed by an appointed servant of the Lord. Jehu's opportunity came suddenly, but he accepted it by faith and immediately began to do what God had commanded. As the 10th king of Israel, Jehu started a new dynasty and reigned for 28 years. Well, here's the situation as Jehu began his crusade. Ahaziah was reigning in Judah and following the counsel of his wicked mother Athaliah and the leaders in the house of Ahab in Israel. Baal was his god, and he had no interest in the law of the Lord. Ahaziah had gone to Jezreel to visit King Joram, who was recovering from wounds received at Ramoth Gilead, and he did not know that God had given Israel a new king. Jehu wanted to catch his enemies by surprise, so he ordered his officers not to spread the word that he was king. It was about 45 miles from Ramoth Gilead to Jezreel, but Jehu was a fast and daring charioteer, and his men were accustomed to traveling at speeds that were alarming in those days. The word peace, or shalom, is repeated 8 times in this section, but the event was actually a declaration of war. Without slowing his pace, Jehu received Joram's 2 messengers and commanded them to ride with his company, and they obeyed. However, when his 2 messengers failed to return to Jezreel, Joram became suspicious and ordered his own chariot to be readied for an escape. In a move that made Jehu's work much easier, Joram and Ahaziah each mounted his royal chariot and rode out to meet the man who had now been identified as Jehu. Perhaps the 2 kings were hoping that Jehu was bringing good news from the front. Joram's question, "Have you come in peace?" might have meant, "Has the battle at Ramoth ended in our favor? Or is your mission one of peace?" If it was the latter one, it suggests that Jehu might have been somewhat of a loose cannon in Joram's army, and perhaps Joram suspected that he had designs on the throne. Jehu's reply instantly told the king that danger was in the air, and he tried to get away. Joram warned his nephew Ahaziah, who did escape but was later caught. But one well-directed arrow ended the life of Joram. As a patient recuperating from wounds, Joram wouldn't be wearing his armor. Providentially, he died on the property of Naboth that Ahab and Jezebel had taken after killing Naboth and his sons. Thus the Lord fulfilled the prophecy he gave to Elijah. Jehu not only executed the king of Israel, but he also killed all the royal princes. 2 Chronicles 22 and verse 8. The reports of Ahaziah's death in 2 Kings 9 and 2 Chronicles 22 aren't easy to harmonize, but we suggest a scenario. Ahaziah was wounded as he fled from Jezreel. He made it to Beth Hagen and then turned northwest at the ascent of Gur and headed for Megiddo, where he tried to hide from Jehu. But Jehu's men tracked him down and killed him at Megiddo. Ahaziah's servants carried his body from Megiddo to Jerusalem, where he was buried with the kings, for he was a descendant of David. Had he not compromised with Joram, worshipped Baal, and followed his mother, Athaliah's counsel, he would have been spared all this shame and defeat. It didn't take long for Jezebel and the palace residents to hear that Jehu was in Jezreel, that he was king, and that he had killed her son Joram. She put on her makeup, attired her head, and watched at an upper window, waiting for him to show up. When she saw him come through the gate, she called, "Is it well, Zimri, your master's murderer?" At about 50 years before, Zimri had killed King Elah and made himself king, and then he had proceeded to exterminate the family of Baasha. Since Zimri ruled for only 7 days and then died by committing suicide, Jezebel was obviously trying to warn Jehu that his authority was weak and his days were numbered. She might even have been suggesting that Jehu form an alliance with her and strengthen his throne. But Jehu knew that his mandate was from the Lord. When he called for evidence of loyalty from the palace personnel, 2 or 3 servants responded, and they threw Jezebel out of the window to the courtyard below. Jehu rode his horse over her body until he was sure she was dead. Since he was now king, Jehu went into the palace and called for something to eat. As he was dining, he remembered that, evil as she was, Jezebel was a princess, the daughter of Ethbaal, the Sidonian ruler. So he ordered the servants to bury her body. But it was too late. Smelling human blood, the wild dogs showed up and ate her body, leaving only her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. It was a gruesome scene, but it was what Elijah had predicted would happen. The fact is that God's word never fails, but accomplishes his purposes on the earth. Isaiah 55, verses 10 and 11. Now we come to 2 Kings, chapters 10 and 11. Studying these 2 chapters gives you the feeling that you're reading the morning paper or watching the 10 o'clock news on television. You meet 2 leaders, Jehu, former army commander and now ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel, and Jehoiada, high priest at the temple in Jerusalem in the southern kingdom. As you watch these 2 men, you recognize the fact that the same forces for good and for evil were at work in their world. And these same forces are at work in our own world today. You also recognize the difference between leaders who are motivated by selfish ambition and those who are motivated by spiritual dedication. Jehu was proud of his zeal for the Lord, but that zeal was a pious cloak that hid the egotism and anger that really motivated his service. God gave Jehu an important work to do, but the king went beyond the assigned boundaries and carried his mandate too far. The Lord commended Jehu for what he accomplished, but he also chastened him for his pride and compromise. Humanly speaking, were it not for the courageous service of the high priest, Jehoiada and his wife Jehoshaphat, the Davidic dynasty would have come to an end. The future of God's promises to David that involved his great plan of salvation was all wrapped up in a boy named Joash. Let's identify the forces that were at work in that day, forces that are still at work in our world today. Years before, Elijah had prophesied that the line of godless King Ahab would come to an end, and that every last descendant of Ahab would be killed. As we have seen, the Lord gave this mission to Jehu when he anointed him king of Israel. Even though the nation was divided into two kingdoms, the Jews were still God's covenant people, and their kings couldn't do whatever they pleased. Ahab and Jezebel had promoted Baal worship in Israel, and when Jehoram, king of Judah, married Athaliah, a daughter of Ahab, he encouraged Baal worship in Judah. By this evil marriage, Jehoram not only corrupted Judah with idol worship, but he corrupted the line of David and jeopardized the fulfillment of the messianic promises. Jehu had already killed Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, and he had also killed Jezebel, the evil wife of Ahab. Now Jehu was on a search and destroy mission to find and kill every one of Ahab's descendants. His first challenge was to get control of the capital city of Samaria, where Ahab's male descendants were being protected and prepared for places of leadership in the government. Jehu knew that his forces couldn't easily take a walled city like Samaria, but being a clever strategist, he knew how to get his enemies to surrender. Once he had taken Samaria, the other key cities in the land would also surrender. Jehu was in Jezreel, according to chapter 9 and verse 30. This was about 25 miles north of Samaria, and from there he communicated with the leaders in Samaria, the palace administrators, the military leaders, and the tutors and guardians of the princes. He knew that if he could intimidate these respected leaders, he could take over the city without a fight. His first challenge was that they choose one of Ahab's male descendants and to put him on the throne and then defend his right to reign. This was probably a suggestion that the new king or a champion of his choice fight Jehu one-on-one and the winner take all. Jehu even pointed out their advantages. They were in a walled city, and they had armor and weapons as well as chariots and horses. Jehu was using a technique that revolutionaries have used successfully for centuries. Make a bold proposal and let the leaders' imaginations create fear in their hearts. Adolf Hitler wrote, "Mental confusion, contradiction of feeling, indecisiveness, panic, these are our weapons." 3 different groups of leaders had to unite on this decision, and these men knew that Jehu had killed 2 kings and disposed of Jezebel. Furthermore, he seemed invincible, for nobody had stood in his way. The message they sent to Jehu at Jezreel was one of complete unconditional surrender. They promised to do whatever he commanded, and they agreed not to name a new king. In short, they accepted Jehu as their king. Now Jehu shows himself to be the master of political double talk. He accepted their submission to his rule and then he ordered them to take the heads of the 70 descendants of Ahab and bring them to Jezreel. So they immediately killed Ahab's descendants and sent messengers to Jezreel with the heads. When they arrived that evening, Jehu ordered the messengers to stack up the heads at the entrance of the city. Certainly, this was a grisly reminder to the people of Jezreel that it didn't pay to get in the way of Jehu. Jehu's divine commission had now become a personal crusade, motivated by his own selfish ambition. Novelist Joseph Conrad wrote, "All ambitions are lawful, except those which climb upward on the miseries and credulities of mankind." Lawful ambition uses truth and builds on the past, while unlawful ambition uses lies and destroys the past. Dictators must annihilate their enemies in order to be safe, but in so doing, they destroy the past and the information and help they need for moving into the future. To prove that he intended to obey God and purge the land of Ahab's family, Jehu proceeded to kill all of Ahab's descendants that he found in Jezreel. But he didn't stop there. He went beyond his divine commission and killed Ahab's close friends, his chief officers, and the priests who served in the palace. It was a complete slaughter based on guilt by association. The Lord wanted to rid the land of Ahab's family so that none of them could usurp the throne. But for Jehu to kill Ahab's friends, officers, and priests was not within the realm of God's commands. In fact, Jehu later had serious problems with the Syrians and could have used some of the wisdom and experience of the court officers that he had killed. By wiping out these former leaders, Jehu destroyed a valuable source of political wisdom and skill. He then left Jezreel and went to Samaria to claim his throne. On the way, he met a group of travelers who were going to Jerusalem to visit King Ahaziah, to whom they were related. They didn't know that King Ahaziah, King Joram, and Queen Jezebel were all dead, and that Jehu had killed them and was now in charge. Since Ahaziah had married into Ahab's family, it seemed logical to Jehu that anybody related to Ahaziah belonged to the enemy. So he had all 42 men killed. But these men weren't related by blood to Ahab. They were descendants of David. Jehu was now attacking the Davidic dynasty. You can see more about this in 2 Chronicles 22 and verse 8. Jehu now encountered an ally in verses 15 through 17 of 2 Kings 10. Jehonadab the Rechabite was a descendant of Moses' brother-in-law Hobab. Jehu took Jehonadab and he used him to give respectability to his own ambitions. They identified, the Rechabites identified with the tribe of Judah, according to Judges 1 and verse 16, but they stayed to themselves and followed the traditions laid down by their ancestors. You can read more about that in Jeremiah chapter 35. These people were respected highly by the Jewish people, but being nomads and tent dwellers, the Rechabites were separated from the everyday city life and politics of the Jews. Jehonadab was just the kind of man that Jehu needed to make his crusade look credible. When Jehonadab took Jehu's hand and stepped into the royal chariot, he declared that he was heart and soul behind the new king. Certainly Jehonadab disapproved of Baal worship and rejoiced to hear that Ahab's family was being eradicated. However, when he met Jehu, Jehonadab didn't know the motives that were driving the king and the ruthless methods he was using. Every ambitious leader needs a respectable second man to help sell his policies and practices to the public. It was bad enough that Jehu had begun to murder innocent people, but now he was using an innocent man to make his crimes look like they were the work of the Lord. However, this is the way that many unscrupulous leaders operate. Jehu's statement, "See my zeal for the Lord," in verse 16, reminds us of the words of Elijah when he was running from Jezebel and hiding in the cave. When Jehu and Jehonadab arrived at Samaria with the company of soldiers, Jehu presented himself as their king, and the people submitted to him. Jehu had already intimidated the rulers of the city, so he met no opposition when he rode through the city gate. The city officers turned Ahab's remaining relatives over to him, and Jehu killed them all. In chapter 10, verses 18 through 28, Jehu had finished the work of ridding the nation of Ahab's family, so there were no descendants who would challenge his right to the throne. But what about the Baal worship that had infected the land? That was Jehu's next responsibility, and he decided to use deception as his major weapon. As king of Israel, Jehu could have dealt with the Baal worshippers in one of three ways. He could have commanded them to leave the land, or he could have obeyed Deuteronomy chapter 13 and have them killed. He might even have tried to convert them, although it would have been easy to convert if the sword was hanging over their head. He also could have ordered the temple of Baal to be torn down. Jehu had promised the support of the leaders in Samaria. Jehu had the promised support of the leaders in Samaria. So why did he choose to lie to the people and then kill them? God's servants are not allowed to do evil that good may come, Romans 3 and verse 8. Yet that's the course that Jehu took. He had authority from Moses to kill the idolaters, and that he did. But why did he deceive them first? He lied to them about himself, claiming that he was more devoted to Baal than Ahab had been. He also lied about the service in the temple of Baal. However, this may have been another instance of Jehu's doublespeak, for there was a great sacrifice to Baal. The sacrifice was the lives of the priests and the worshippers in Baal's temple. Jehu was a military man whose life was so dedicated to strategy and conquest that, unlike David, he couldn't bring faith and the glory of God into his battles. Jehu seems to have had a lust for blood and a joy in outsmarting his enemies, and we've never read that he sought the will of the Lord in any of his endeavors. First, he assembled the prophets, ministers, and priests of Baal, and he commanded them to announce a great sacrifice for Baal. Coming from the king through the religious leaders, the announcement would carry much more weight and be more believable. Jehu even sent messengers throughout the land to command the Baal worshippers to attend the great sacrifice in Samaria. The house of Baal in Samaria was built by Ahab for Jezebel, so Jehu would destroy the house of Ahab in two senses: his physical house or family, and the house that he built for Baal. Well, once the people were in the temple, Jehu made sure that no true worshippers of Jehovah were among the worshippers of Baal. He commanded that the Baal worshippers wear the special garments that were used during their services, and he and Jehonadab admonished the priest not to allow any outsiders to participate. Jehu gave the impression that he wanted pure worship for the great sacrifice. Once the Baal worshippers were ready inside the temple, Jehu instructed his 80 soldiers outside the temple to be ready to enter the temple as soon as the sacrifice was ended. The question next comes, does the he in verse 25 in the King James Version refer to Jehu or to the high priest of Baal? The New American Standard thinks it is referring to Jehu, but not knowing the layout of the temple or the order of the service, It's difficult to decide. How could the king be visible at the altar and, without raising suspicion, leave the altar and go outside to command the soldiers? It's likely that Jehu provided the animals for the sacrifices, so in that sense he was sacrificing to Baal, whether he was at the altar or not. The soldiers killed all the Baal worshippers in the temple and threw their bodies outside into the court. Then some of the men went into the inner shrine of the temple and removed the wooden images of the gods and the stone image of Baal and destroyed them. What once was the sacred house of Baal was turned into a public latrine. Jehu's plan worked and enabled him in one day to wipe out Baal worship in the land. By lying to the people, he accumulated a larger crowd of Baal worshippers than if he had gone after them one by one. But it's unfortunate that his first public act as king in Samaria was an act of deception. Could anybody trust him after this point? Well, once things quieted down, Jehu had a long reign of 28 years. But he followed the ways of Jeroboam and worshipped the golden calves at Dan and Bethel. The calves were supposed to be only symbols of Jehovah, but it was idolatry just the same. In spite of his zeal for the Lord, Jehu was an idolater at heart who used the Lord's name only to cover up his sins. By being a part of the national religion, Jehu united the people and gained their respect. Jehu was a consummate politician to the very end. You know, the Lord commended Jehu for the work that he had done and rewarded him by giving him the longest dynasty in the history of the northern kingdom, over 100 years. He was succeeded by Jehoahaz, Joash, Jeroboam II, and Zechariah, all of whom were bad kings. But the prophet Hosea announced that the Lord was displeased with Jehu for murdering innocent people. Jehu established his dynasty by killing King Joram at Jezreel, and for this God would judge him. Jezreel means God scatters, and he would scatter the northern kingdom by allowing the Assyrians to conquer them in 722 BC. Jehu's great-great-grandson Zechariah reigned only 6 months and was assassinated by Shallum, who reigned only 1 month. The dynasty began with a murder and ended with a murder. But even during Jehu's lifetime, the Lord punished him by allowing Israel's old enemy Syria to take territory from the tribes east of the Jordan. Having the enemy living right across the Jordan River wasn't a comfortable situation for the nation. Jehu was an effective soldier, but he was not much of a builder, and he's remembered only for the people he killed. He could have assembled a group of gifted men to assist him in promoting the true faith in the land, but he settled for following the crowd and worshiping the golden calves. In 2 Kings 11, we now move to the southern kingdom of Judah, where the throne was empty because Jehu had killed King Ahaziah near Jezreel. The queen mother Athaliah, a daughter of Ahab, saw her opportunity and seized the throne, reigning for 6 years. As the founder of Baal worship in Judah, she had no desire to see the Davidic dynasty succeed. She tried to kill all the royal princes, but one survived. David's family was rapidly being destroyed. When Jehoram became king of Judah, he killed all his brothers and some of the princes of Israel to prevent them from dethroning him, and the Arabian invaders had killed Jehoram's older sons. Jehu had killed some of David's descendants, and now Athaliah ordered the royal seed to be wiped out. Athaliah was retaliating because of all that Jehu had done in eradicating Ahab's family and Baal worship in Israel. To return evil for good is demonic. To return good for evil is godlike. And to return evil for evil and good for good is just human. Wherever there is conflict in this world, you'll usually find this spirit of revenge and retaliation. As individuals used to fight duels to uphold their personal honor, so nations sometimes fight wars to protect their national honor. But by killing the royal seed, Athaliah was rebelling against the Lord Jehovah, who had promised David that he would have a descendant sitting on his throne in Jerusalem. You know, most of us don't go to that extreme in seeking to pay back our enemies, but revenge isn't an unknown thing among God's people. Moses in the law admonished his people not to practice revenge, Leviticus 19:18. And Solomon gave the same counsel in Proverbs 20 and verse 22 and Proverbs 24 and verse 29. Jesus taught against personal revenge in Matthew 5:38-48, as did the apostles Paul, Romans 12, and Peter, 1 Peter 3. Planning and executing revenge does far more harm to the perpetrator than to the victim. Many famous authors have written about sweet revenge, but experience shows that revenge is very bitter. A Jewish proverb says, "The smallest revenge will poison the soul." Well, when wicked Athaliah killed the heirs to David's throne, the faithful remnant in Judah must have wondered where God was and what he was doing. Why would he make a covenant promise to David and not keep it? How could he allow the Queen Mother to do such an evil deed and jeopardize the future of the Messianic line? But God was still on the throne and had his servants prepared to act. In a world that seems to be controlled by deceit and selfish ambition, there are still people like Jehoiada and Jehoshaphat who have faith in God's word and courageously do his will. Jehoiada was the high priest, and Jehoshaphat, his wife, was a princess, a daughter of King Jehoram, and a sister to King Ahaziah, whom Jehu had killed. This made her an aunt to the young Joash. That such a godly woman should come out of that family it's a wonderful thing. Knowing what Athaliah planned to do, the priest and the princess stole 1-year-old Joash from the royal nursery and hid him with his nurse, first in a room where old bedding was stored, and then in a room in the temple. As he grew older, he mingled and played with the other children in the temple area and was not recognized as an heir to the throne. Jehoiada and Jehoshaphat and the boy's nurse had the patience to wait for God's time, for faith and patience go together, Hebrews 6 and verse 12. In his gracious providence, the Lord watched over the child, as well as the 3 people who knew who he was and where he was. For if Queen Athaliah had known what they were doing, she would surely have at least tried to kill them along with the prince. Jehoiada called together the 5 officers who were in charge of the temple guard. He presented the king to them and had them take an oath to obey his orders and tell no one what was going to transpire. After outlining his plan, he sent them throughout the kingdom of Judah to order the Levites living away from Jerusalem and the heads of the Jewish families to come to Jerusalem on a specific Sabbath day. They were to assemble at the temple as though they were there to worship the Lord. Jehoiada's plan was simple but effective. The 5 officers each commanded 100 men. 2 companies would ordinarily be on duty daily and be replaced on the Sabbath day. But on this particular Sabbath, they would remain on duty and guard the king. A 3rd company would guard the palace where Athaliah lived, and this would give her a false sense of security. A 4th company was assigned to the gate Shur, or the foundation gate. which may have led from the nearby palace to the temple area. The fifth company assembled at the gate behind the guardhouse, a normal place for the temple guards to gather. Anybody watching at the temple would have no reason to suspect that anything dramatic was about to occur. They would see the guards march in and take their usual places, and they might notice that the crowd of worshippers in the temple was larger than usual. The high priest distributed to the men the weapons that David had confiscated in his many battles, and the guards protected David's own heir with those weapons. It was David who purchased the property on which the temple stood, and it was David who provided the wealth that enabled Solomon to build the temple. Some of it came from his own personal treasury, and the rest from the spoils of the battles that he had fought for the Lord. He wrote many of the songs that the Levites sang in the temple services, and now he was, by proxy, providing the weapons to defend his own dynasty. David not only served his own generation, but every generation that followed. When everybody was in place, Jehoiada brought out the 7-year-old king and presented him to the people. Jehoiada put the crown on Joash's head and gave him a copy of the law of God that he was to obey. The high priest anointed him, and the people joyfully welcomed him as their ruler. God save the king is literally, let the king live. God had kept his covenant promise and returned one of David's descendants to the throne of Judah. Well, God had protected the young king and had enabled Jehoiada and the officers to present him to the people, but the work wasn't over yet. The repeated shout of God save the king startled Athaliah, and she hastened out of the palace to see what was happening. The first thing she discovered was that she was trapped. There were guards around the palace and between the palace and the temple courts, so there was no opportunity for her to escape or for her own soldiers to come to the rescue. She hurried to the temple court where she saw the young king standing by the pillar, protected by the captains. She also saw that the assembly was made up not only of priests, Levites, and military personnel, but also the people of the land, that is, the land-holding citizens whose work, wealth, and influence were important to the nation. How paradoxical that she should shout, "Treason, treason," when she was the real traitor. Joash was a descendant of David and had every right to the throne, while Athaliah had seized the throne and had no claim to it. Jehoiada ordered the 5 military captains to escort her out of the temple area and told the guards to kill anybody who followed her. Once they were back on the palace grounds near the horse gate, they killed her. Jehoiada had already given the Holy Covenant to the king in verse 12, but it was necessary that both the people and the king affirm their allegiance to one another and to the Lord. Israel was a theocracy, and God was their king. The king ruled as God's chosen representative, and the people obeyed the king as they would obey the Lord, for the law of Israel was the law of the Lord. Israel was a covenant nation, for at Mount Sinai their ancestors had sworn allegiance to the Lord and to his word. No other nation on earth had this same covenant relationship to the Lord. No one outside of Israel was ever given the law of Moses to follow, and that includes you and me. As Jehu had done in Samaria, so Jehoiada did in Jerusalem. He and the people destroyed the temple of Baal and killed the chief priest of Baal before the altar of Baal. No doubt they also executed the other people who were leaders in Baal worship. They also destroyed the temple of Baal and the altar and images that it contained. Because of Athaliah and her compromising husband Jehoram and their son Ahaziah, the kingdom of Judah had been infected with idolatry for at least 15 years, and now the infection was exposed and removed. What a joyful crowd it was that escorted the king from the temple to the palace, where they placed him on the throne. The messianic promise was still in force. The people had done the will of God and obeyed His word. And for the first time in many years, righteousness and peace reigned in the land. We learn from 2 Kings 12 that the temple of the Lord had been grossly neglected and abused during this time that Athaliah was the power behind the throne. Jehoiada immediately took steps to remedy this situation by following David's orders and putting the proper priests and Levites into places of ministry. It was important that they offer the daily sacrifices to the Lord and sing praises to Him. It was also essential that the doors of the temple be guarded so that no unclean person might enter and defile the other worshipers. Revival is simply obeying God's word and doing what He commanded our fathers to do. We don't need the novelties of the present. We need the realities of the past. When God began to restore true worship in Jerusalem and Judah, He started with one dedicated couple, Jehoiada the high priest and his wife Jehosheba. They enlisted the nurse who cared for Joash, and God protected all four of them for 6 years. Then Jehoiada enlisted the 5 military captains, who in turn assembled their 500 soldiers. The scattered priests, Levites, and people of the land came together as one to honor the Lord and obey His word. Sin was purged, and God's will was accomplished, and the name of the Lord was glorified. God could do it then, and He can do it today, but we must trust Him to have His way. We must trust Him and follow what He has revealed in His word. We're out of time for this session, so we'll pick up with 2 Kings chapters 12 and 13 when we return in the next session. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to write or call and make an appointment or whatever you need to do to get in touch with me. I'll be glad to help any way I can. Thank you.